Maybe don't know.
This time, this time, this time, this time, this time to build, this time to build, this time to build, this time, this time to build, this time to build, this time to build, this time, power, this time to build, power, this time to build, power, this time to build, power.
What's up, everybody? I am your host, Chris Hampton. Welcome to episode 117 of the Power Company Podcast, brought to you by PowerCompanyClimbing.com. It is the day after Christmas, which means that some of the craziness of shipping things out, people buying training plans as gifts, thank you, by the way, is over. But it also means that our 3-year birthday for the podcast is coming up. New Year's Eve 2016 was episode 1 with Carlo Traversi. And we started this year with around 200,000 downloads, which seemed crazy at the time. And I decided decided makes it sound calculated, more like I blurted out that a seemingly unattainable goal of 1 million by the end of this year, because I just like big goals and pushing toward them. And we did not get there, which is not surprising, but we have had nearly 500,000 downloads this year, which barely even makes sense to my little brain. And even if I only put out one episode a month in 2019, we'll get to that million by next year, end of next year. Don't worry, though. I've got more in the can than ever, 50 or more sitting and waiting episodes, and I can't just let those sit. So you won't just be getting one a month next year. And we're going to get there, which is exciting. Anyway, thanks to all of you for a successful 2018 and for helping us hit 2019 with a nearly uncontrollable amount of momentum. I appreciate all of that support. I was introduced to today's guest, Ayo Sopeju, by Tonde Catillo at the CWA last year. Speaking of which, there'll be big news about CWA 2019 coming soon, so stay tuned for that. Tonde just said that you should interview this guy. And I didn't know anything about Ayo, but a very brief conversation yielded that I'd be visiting the Minneapolis Bouldering Project, where he's head setter for a performance climbing coach seminar. And I trust Tonde's opinion, so I did some research, and Ayo and I made it happen. Ayo is a world-class competitor, but it was his setting and art, or more exactly the intersection of the two, that really interested me. We sat down in the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and you'll hear that ambiance in this conversation, and had what turned out to be one of my absolute favorite interviews of the year. So let's get into this.
Maybe don't know.
The way I imagine what happens when a climber or competitor does well is that they climb what is in front of them in a way that is really expressive of them and their interpretation.
Power, this time to build, power, this time to build, power, this time to build, power.
I started drawing a bunch just after university, and for me, I look at a lot of art and realize that I was terrible at drawing real things. So I kind of tried to go in the opposite direction, and thought, okay, if I can't draw things well, I should draw things really simply. So I just kind of tripped on the idea of parallel lines being the simplest thing I could draw.
Mm-hmm.
And then because everyone can draw a line, to figure out a way that I could draw or add lines in a way that meant that you could understand exactly how it was made, but that it took a long time or
Yeah.
a really, really weird degree of care.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be the
That's
only
a good way to
difference.
describe it, a weird degree of care. One of the things that was really fascinating to me is when I first saw your work, at first glance, because that's just what we do on social media. We just glance and swipe, you know? And at first glance, it looked like lines.
Yeah.
But then as you get closer and pay more attention, it's actually space that's creating these images, and it's these little outlined areas.
Yeah, it's true. At first, it does look like just individual lines, but each line is a parallel line.
Right.
And so, the negative space has a lot to do with what is happening and why it ends up being a little more interesting the closer you get, I think, to the drawings.
Yeah. So which came first for you, climbing or art?
Maybe they were both. The drawing for sure was always there. I was always interested in drawing, and always actually really interested in people who could draw well.
Yeah.
I have never considered myself good at being able to represent things in a way that you could recognize them, and for sure that has always impressed me in people. So I think that, yeah, as a pursuit, drawing first. I didn't start climbing until I was about 18.
Okay.
And then professionally, I think I kind of stumbled into both again right around the same time.
Had you already started to develop this parallel line style at the time that you were professionally falling into both?
I was for sure already setting at that point. But I think this parallel line thing started a little bit later. Yeah. I was house sitting a friend's place who was on a climbing trip actually, and had been sketching just because I was bored, waiting for something to cook, I think, pasta to boil. And I think I started to draw like an octopus, and its arms did something like the parallel lines on like a more loose scale. So I shrunk it over a couple of days, and I think that's where the parallel line things started. I was already setting a bunch at that point for sure. So I don't think that if you're asking if there was a connection between those things, loosely, I think I was starting to think of myself as, or deciding what I might do with my life.
Right.
And I think, as it became an idea that it was possible to sort of be a root setter, something similar came out of drawing and producing art, whether it meant that I was going to be an artist.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily trying to draw a connection between those things, but I do think that there are similarities in your art and your setting and your demeanor in general. I can draw parallels there for sure. Maybe I'm totally reaching into left field, who knows? But I do find it interesting that your demeanor, your setting, your being, for lack of a better word, I would never connect to competition climbing.
Ah, interesting.
Partly because of my perspective of competition climbing, because I was never a comp climber, and I don't have that that background, that perspective. So I'm curious to know competition climbing and then setting as what appears to be an art form. And Tonde would tell me, no, it's not art. Setting as design, let's say that.
Yeah.
They seem to be a little at odds in my mind. And they're obviously not in yours. So I'm curious how they work together as a competitor moving to the setting side. I know that's a out there layered question.
Yeah, there might be a few questions in there, but if I move back into the connection between all those things, I think that is an obsession of mine. Something that happens for me always is I am always trying to connect things.
Yeah.
So if there is a connection between competitive climbing and route setting, and then in some further off place art, I think expression is a really central idea in those things, in like how we can express an idea or a feeling, and then maybe what is the goal of each of those things. I'm sure in some ways the idea came from watching other climbers and conversations with people like Tonde, actually. So one of the new ideas that is forming a lot of what I think or how I feel about what is the goal of a competitive climber is that the climber who is really effective in a competition round is actually just expressing themselves very well at a really high level in each boulder.
Sure. And inside some sort of parameters.
Yeah, that's right. The format is one of the parameters, the 5 minutes or 4 minutes, or
right.
What we do in that, and then the boulder itself. In an old idea for me, the climber has to find out what the route setter has given or decided or something like that. But then more recently, the way I imagine what happens, and what happens really well when a climber or a competitor does well, is that they climb what is in front of them in a way that is really expressive of them and their interpretation. And that's how you do well in a competition, that you're able to express yourself very well. For the route setter, something similar is that we understand parameters, the materials we have, the area, the place where we are, and then things like what we're supposed to produce, and then how we can express ourselves in that space to satisfy things like who will climb this thing, who will attempt it, how can they interpret, and how will they try to interpret this thing, and then is there some intersection between what we place there and how they perceive it. So we are trying to express an idea. As a route setter, it can be something as simple as grade, but it can also be something as complex as grief.
Sure.
And then does this translate into the climber? Do they feel or understand, or how do they feel or understand or look at it? And then maybe in like a similar sense, this is what we're doing with art as well. We're trying to express some idea.
And you've given yourself these parameters.
Right.
You're drawing parallel lines, and you're stretching those. You know, I just commented looking at your work that one of the things I noticed seeing it in person is that some of the lines are considerably heavier, some of the lines are considerably softer, and that gives it this feeling of depth. And so within those parameters, which sound very simple on the surface, I'm only going to draw on parallel lines.
Right.
There are still a lot of ways you can express yourself within those parameters.
Yeah.
And then I may get a different feeling out of it.
That's the most interesting thing for me is always that in each of those three contexts, maybe in two of the three contexts, we produce something and the interpretation is more powerful than the object for me. The artist makes something and then it's, for me, it's gone. It's not mine anymore. Someone sees it, and that's the interesting thing. In the root setting, this is also, for me, very true, is we produce this thing, we intend something very, either something very loose or something very specific. We want them to climb this way, or we want them to interpret something, or even we want to see what they interpret, and then it's theirs again. The consumer, the climber, the person that's going to play with this thing or be massively frustrated by this thing does it without us.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I'm not a root setter, when I'm in the gym, the language we use surrounding how we're climbing on a problem is things like, what did the root setter intend,
right,
or I broke their beta, or things like that. And maybe that's not accurate. Maybe what's actually happening is you've built this thing, created, designed this thing, and then it had no real specific intention other than to give someone an emotion, a feeling, an experience.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't always have the intention of making that really specific.
Right. Yeah, I think in my sort of, if I could say, life as a root setter, the first things for sure for a long time that I made were like that. The context of setting it was that we force them to do this.
Right.
Was the language that we used as root setters. But I think that's changed a little bit because the climbers are much better than we are, and they're much more creative very often than we are. The idea that they can almost always break beta, they can almost always find a new way, means for me that I lose less.
Right.
If I present a scenario and actually in the way that now I think that I try to conceive these things is that we present something as a proposition, actually, that the proposition is this grade, and the climbers will answer that. They'll say something like, no, this is terrible, or this is definitely not that, or they will accept it as this feels like, V8 or 2 or 0.
Well, it's an interesting concept for me that a root setter would approach a problem as if I'm creating it and then I separate from it after I give it to you.
I see.
And when I make paintings, my wife very often will want to keep everything I paint. And my take is I didn't paint it for me.
Right.
And now I can just let it go and put it out into the world. You know, I don't want to hold on to these things. And she never could understand that. She's like, how could you give this up? Like, you spent all this time on it.
Yeah.
And but it did what I needed it to do.
Right.
And now I want it to do something for someone else, whatever that might be. And I hadn't viewed root setting that way necessarily. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Tonde is wrong. It's art.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that I am realizing as I travel and meet more root setters is that we really have takes on what's happening.
Yeah.
And to defend Tonde in a sort of abstract, weird way.
Please do. He's not here to defend himself. So
yeah, it's true that for him it is probably design, but for someone else it will truly be something else. And we do produce a boulder at the end.
Yep.
And it is climbed or not climbed or consumed by someone else who will see it some other way. And for each of us, it is, I think, that. And that's what's really, for me, really interesting, is that I can go to Italy and someone says, no, this is pizza, not root setting.
Right.
And for them, it is actually. But for me, it can be something totally different. For me, it's, no, this is definitely climbing, or this is definitely art.
Right.
Yeah.
What year did you start setting?
I don't know if I remember really exactly, but I think I've been setting for around the 13-ish, 13, 14,
Okay.
15 maybe.
So was
years.
that pre the time when gyms were starting to switch over to monochromatic sets and
Definitely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have no concept of time anymore. I'm just old and I've been here forever, so I have no concept of when that actually happened. Was setting as interesting to you when you could just grab any hold of any color, of any type, or has it become more interesting by tightening the parameters?
Right. Yeah. Constraints is a huge, maybe theme in setting and in what is happening. I bump into setters all the time who ask me almost that question exactly. If you set in only this color and you only have these holds, are you limited?
Right.
Yes, definitely. If I could change every single hold into any color I wanted to at any point,
Right.
I wouldn't be limited in the same way. But and that has sort of in some scenarios is very frustrating. I think of a perfect hold or the perfect hold,
Right.
and it does not exist.
I don't have it in this
Right.
color, so I can't do it.
But in the best scenario, if I concentrate, if I work really hard, I can produce something more interesting and more unexpected with that constraint. I think if we think about it really quickly, without a lot of effort, we are simply constrained. But the best, whatever we are, root setters or problem solvers, really, and this is kind of close to the competitive climber. If we wrestle with this thing really hard, we can be very creative with it, and that space of being really, really creative produces really interesting things. Yeah, where I can take this weird screw-on that's too small to produce V0, and then I can produce V0.
Right.
You know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when I was first sort of developing my music years ago, one of my favorite ways to build my skills was to give myself this set of constraints. You know, I have to do these certain things or the song isn't complete, you know, and that limited me for sure.
Yeah.
But it definitely forces you outside of your own little box that you've built for yourself, you know, and we all have it no matter who we are. So yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about the fact that those constraints do build more creativity. We want to think of creativity as, oh, the world is at my fingertips. I can do anything I want to. But having those constraints forces you to think in a different way.
Yeah. There's a theory in evolution. It's called punctuated equilibrium. It suggests something like that the biggest evolutionary events happen when there's some pressure.
Right. Development happens when something's blocking
exactly.
it. Yeah.
And then in the times when we have all of we have all the food, there are no predators. We don't need to change. We don't really need to evolve.
Right.
So we kind of just
stagnate.
We stay the same.
Yeah.
It's not nice when we introduce wolves into the system, but it produces really interesting things. It produces faster animals, or animals that can hide, or animals that can change color.
Right.
And that's, I think, in a lot of not just creative places, but really in any place that we have to produce some work, results that we didn't expect. And the results that we didn't expect are, for me, the most interesting.
Yeah. For just a nuts and bolts question here, do you ever encounter a situation where or how do you react in a situation when you are looking for that perfect hold, you know you want there, it doesn't exist, and you really want to create this specific thing? Do you ever just start at the beginning, strip it all, start over, or do you always solve from that point forward?
No, I think this is the where the design thinking comes in a little bit. Is that we do one of the constraints is for a root setter is time.
Yeah,
it has to be done or open or given to the public at 5.
Right.
And certainly if you're around the gym, you'll know I push that limit a little bit. But it's not sometimes possible to do that. Sometimes we say, oh, I actually do have time to destroy this thing and begin again. But other times I don't. I must make this thing work now.
Right.
And so if it's possible, if we do have the time to rethink the idea completely, and we can produce something that's nicer, then I will try to do that.
Do you ever go back, or is there a constraint in place that prevents this, where you have to get this to the public at 5? It's 4:30.
Right.
You're not satisfied with the answer that you've come up with. Do you ever come back the next day and say, I'm changing what I did yesterday?
In my context, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, in my context, the point at which we let it go, that's it. All the lessons we learn from it, watching people destroy this thing or enjoy this thing, mean that we can take that information and apply it later, but not that we can change it.
Right.
Yeah, one of the things that is for me very similar between how I treat commercial root setting project in a gym and in a competition is that at the moment where someone touches it, we can't change it anymore. And I like that idea a lot because it puts some pressure on me to do both things, to watch, to pay lots of attention with every detail, because I can't fix it. I can't take it back. And so if I'm not learning from it, it was wasted.
I like that you just brought detail into your root setting, because that's something about your art that's very, very apparent. And really, I mean, I'm going right back to your whole approach to everything appears to be meticulous to some degree. And knowing that that's part of your root setting makes sense, because I've looked at your art, you know. Is there a flexible level of detail there that you believe is okay? Are there root setters who can be a little more, for lack of a better term, impressionistic and less detailed?
Well, without a doubt, yeah, there are. If detail is a strength of mine, it is also a weakness.
Okay, explain.
I mean, I watch some root setters, and some of the root setters that I admire and whose work is, for me, so interesting are those that can produce really, really good work really sort of loosely. They don't have to place everything in the perfect spot.
Right.
And one of the things that I've tried to do quite a bit is to not hold on to those details the same way.
Right,
Right. I know that I will look at every single detail right to the finest. Which angle did we put this screw in to this hold?
Right.
But that many other people will not see that. To some degree, that's important that I do, because it has implications on many levels, on bigger levels. But if I put a screw on in the perfect spot and no one ever uses it, that means I've overlooked something. I've wasted that energy. And that's one way where I think that if I'm looking too finely at this, they'll stand right here. This is the only place. And then someone can just come and just mash their foot on anything and get it done.
Right.
That's a shortcoming. I think some of these details or some of that sort of specificity.
So are you always trying to or striving to strip things down to the essentials?
That's for me, that's a really central question of bouldering. Yeah. What is bouldering? If you ask me that question, what is bouldering, or what is a boulder, or how does it stand in the context of climbing? Something about minimalism is at its core of the culture of bouldering. We've took a mountain and shrunk it. In an analogy, actually, that I'm stealing again from Tonde, we abstracted this thing, a mountain, to a triangle.
Yep.
And for me, yes, minimalism is a really important part of bouldering, in hiding a sequence, in abstracting the clues that we can take about how to climb it. And I think that the more we remove from the objects and the surfaces that tell us actually how to climb it, the more we have to interpret these ideas from what's left. And those are the the creative and expressive aspects of the climber that they add back in. I want to give you a thing that doesn't look like climbing at all.
Right.
And I want you to tell me how it is climbing.
Right. So, keeping along the lines of gym evolution, setting evolution, at some point in the last, again, I have no concept of time, but at some point in the last 5 years, somewhere around there, density of holds in the gyms seemed to have gotten less and less, and gym size in general has gotten bigger and bigger. So we're left with a couple of lines on a section of wall.
Yeah.
For me, that's very aesthetically pleasing when I walk into the gym.
Yeah.
Though I'm also stimulated by things like the A or cats and spray walls that are completely covered in holds. If I were to pull something from your artwork, I would guess that the fewer lines, open spaces seems more in your wheelhouse, but is that the case? Because I could also make a case for why the spray walls and these clustered walls work for you as well.
Yeah. If you come into MVP, it's true. I think that the thing that strikes people very powerfully is the number of lines seems quite few. And I think that has something to do for me with one of the things that is being asked of route setters a lot is to create a particular experience. The lines that fall into some of the cultural characteristics that we value in climbing, that are pure, that are clean and easy to see or read and interpret, I think for me are part of that question. When the owner of a gym says to me, we need to produce something for a climber that is easy to attempt, actually, where their experience has to do with interaction with the climbing or the climb that's intended and not necessarily the others.
Right. From the moment they walk in the door as well, not just
that's right.
when they pull onto that problem.
Yeah. If the experience happens from the parking lot, actually, that's very powerful.
Yeah.
If they look into the windows of the gym and are captivated there, then for sure that I've done a good job, or I've started my job. And if I understand my job as beginning there, I think that I'm a better route setter. But the same thing can happen in the exact opposite. There's a picture of a spray wall in Japan that I've seen, and a few people have sent it to me now.
Project wall, Dai's gym.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That the holds are so close together that it seems like almost unusable.
Right.
Can we even hold all of those holds? The impact of that is at least as powerful as the minimal gym where if you look in, there are only 5 boulders.
Yeah.
I think that we choose the aesthetic. We choose the way that we create this impact. And that's what I think is happening in a lot of the places for the climber who doesn't know what is going on. For an ease of use of someone who walks in off the sidewalk, or for someone who is fully enculturated and believes that the purest line is not the boulder that has 1,000 eliminates on it. It has this singular thing. Those places interact really well in a place like MVP. But even myself, if you move a little further into the gym, you'll see that the spray wall is really different. It does not follow those constraints at all.
Right.
It is about similar ideas about a weird type of experimentation, but it is maximalism. It is not minimal at all.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that idea is, for me, really, really interesting. I spend quite a bit of time when I'm climbing in the spray wall because of its, it allows me to be very creative and to experiment and to be very
As
expressive.
the user.
Yeah, that's right. In a lot of the other boulders that I have a lot of, or at least some control over how they turn out or how they feel, the ability to surprise is still, for me, in spray walls quite a bit.
That's really cool. So I'm going to just continue along this line because now you keep raising questions for me. Holds have changed dramatically over the last decade as well. And as a home wall owner, I'm always looking for function. I want the holds that have the most use for the smallest footprint.
Right.
And that's not necessarily what gyms are going for now.
Right.
I'm sure there are lots of factors that play into that, such as, again, the gyms are huge. So having a giant hold that's really only usable in one space fills that area nicely and seems to be a little more balanced than just a couple of small crimps. Do you have a preference for setting with larger holds, even if there's only one small usable surface? Do you have a preference for setting with sizes, or does it depend on the problem? What goes through what's your process there?
I don't think I have necessarily a preference. That's a really great question. If
Because I love to look at the big holds. Like, I want to have giant holds on my wall, but I know the function is more important for me in that space.
Right. I would answer that for sure in two ways. One, personally, if you say something like, well, I'll build your own gym, the one that you want to live in, actually, I might choose something like small holds. I might go in that direction a little bit, but in the same way, for me the constraint, the potential, the connection between utility and a small hold is blurred to me these days. If we only put 4 holds on the wall and I'm asked to make 1,000 boulders, that asks me to be creative, and that is a thing that is valuable in the culture of climbing for me, that the climber who sees 1,000 boulders from one hold understands something or touches something that's really valuable in climbing, and I want to create that feeling as well. For a particular boulder, when I produce it for a member base, the scenario determines exactly what I need. If it's a big hold or a small hold, is that what I must create at this exact moment? Is this boulder supposed to be this, or is it supposed to be? Am I creating the V0 that is about the hugest holds possible, or is it about making the V0 that is about the simplest smallest holds possible. So for sure, I think we have to go in. For me, we have to go in both directions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you think about the negative space in the gym, on the walls? You know, when you're doing a new set, it's essentially you have this section of the gym as canvas. Do you think about the aesthetics of the space you're filling in versus the negative space? Or is it totally utilitarian?
There is, I think, a stronger connection between utility and the placement of objects in this visual field, if we can say something like that. I 100% look at the negative space for sure, because again, for me, the impact I create starts from the parking lot. It starts from where we first interact with this thing. If you see something from outside the gym and you move to it and that's the first thing you touch, then we have done something right to create a particular type of experience. So to answer your question, I do treat negative space very carefully, but it is in the end subservient to utility. I must understand that there are 1,000 people actually who need to move through this space, sometimes in a day, and I can't produce only 5 boulders for these 1,000 people. So one of the considerations is, okay, first, how can we create impact in an individual line? And then how do we differentiate it from the line that moves beside it or on top of it, so that we can maintain a powerful experience that is not easily confused, but where we can accommodate, or at least move towards accommodating gyms these days that literally see that. They see 1,500 check-ins a day.
Sure.
So that's one of the considerations for sure in my visual evaluation of the wall, is how close can we make these boulders in different styles, even stacking them directly on top of each other, and maintain the experience that is the cultural center of climbing, that says something like, this line is beautiful. This is the one that I want to climb. Can we do that for every single boulder is a very difficult question, but one I think that I want to try to move towards answering in every set, really.
Yeah, something that happened that I really enjoyed, and I hadn't thought about the setter's role in this actually, which is a massive oversight on my part. During the seminar this week at MVP, I ask all of the coaches to go find a limit bouldering sequence, a short, difficult sequence that they're excited to work on, and spend the next 30 minutes working on it. And simultaneously, I'm asking them to all coach each other, and let's work on the language we use while we're coaching, and struggle through it together. And what ended up happening is, it's a big gym. There's a lot of space. There are places where one person could be hidden around the corner and you might not see them for the entire session. But that's not what went down. People congregated in spaces where there would be a V3 climber next to a V10 climber, next to a V6 climber, all climbing in the same space together and excited for each other. And that happened naturally. I didn't say, you 3 go to this section of wall, you 3 go to this section of wall. And I think from a gym's perspective, that's probably really, really valuable, because it creates this really supportive atmosphere
Yeah.
around the boulders.
Yeah, I think another thing that is being asked of root setters is what is the connection between placing these things on the wall and supporting the community that touches them? What's the connection between V0 and the climber that is in that space at V0 and the climber that is in that space at V13? And for sure, we pay some attention to that as well. That if all the V0s are in one side of the gym and all the V4s are at the other side of the gym, we divide the community in a really strange way that doesn't allow the interaction of these people who are family. They might be parents and kids, or they might just be a group of friends.
Right.
Yeah, who are traveling through this gym and climbing different things, but are really having a similar experience that they either brought or they create in that space. So, yeah, it's important that those ideas are balanced a little bit for me, because that is just a material reality of who we're climbing with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we're basically getting at here is that Tonde's right in its design. I really want to just prove him wrong, but he keeps being right. So when we were on our way here, we're right now we're sitting at, is it Minneapolis Institute of Art or
Yes.
Minnesota Institute of Art? It's one of the two.
It's Minneapolis.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we're sitting here in this shared space, but on our way here, you mentioned that you thought it would be an interesting intersection of form and function, and how that's in relating to climbing and setting and in gyms currently. And when we first walked in here and we sat down, the place was empty. And then everyone listening heard all of the commotion. They heard the blocks being played with in the background by the kids. And when that was first happening, I was like, we should just stop this and move somewhere else. But then I thought about your comments about form and function, and in a place like an art institute here, in an art gallery, in a museum, we walk in and we're often thinking only of form. And then hearing this kid behind us playing with the blocks makes me realize there's function happening here too. How do you see those things playing together in the gym? And I know that lots of people have differing opinions on this, and we've touched a little bit on it through this conversation, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, it's true. There are a lot of communities and uses that happen in a place like the gym, and here as well. A lot of the objects, and one level, the objects that are on display here are not all and have not all been created as art pieces.
Right. We see them that way, but they
Right.
were created as something functional.
Exactly. At the point they were created, this was a bowl,
Right.
and it was made with cultural influence, but it was to house food. And we now see it as a representation of something that is art, or that we can put in an art institute. And that's a really interesting intersection that I think is similar to one that it can happen in the gym as well, is that we can create something and it is utilitarian. We can say, this is a representation of V3, but someone else will have an experience on it that is powerful for them, that takes it past simple utility. That's one example that for me happens all the time, and one that in my practice I like to think that I'm moving towards. I'm trying to do something like that in the setting. But another thing that happens for sure in the gym is that we create this place where people come into, and they're using it in vastly different ways. Some will literally just look. So whether it's a parent or a grandparent or a brother or a sister, they literally will just look. Or if there's someone is just coming to the space to work, actually. And some are using it in another completely different way. This is the place that I hang out with my grandson. And we kind of have to pay some attention to those things. It also means something about a give and take. That in the Art Institute, there is a section where kids can play with blocks, and that is connected to the creation of art or the representation of art and who takes place in it. So yeah, it is kind of funny that we are here. We found a quiet place, but the people have found us too.
Yeah. And like I said, at first I got really annoyed with it. Like the technical side of me is like, this is going to sound horrible, but that's really not the case. And it just sounds like life.
Right.
And that's what this really all is. And now thinking about the objects in these galleries here, we were looking at these ceremonial masks and religious items, and like you mentioned, bowls. I walk in, I see those things as art. Someone created them with function in mind, but also with an eye toward the form.
Yeah.
And I think that's something interesting as well, going back to the evolution of climbing in gyms that has happened both in the gym, the gym building itself and in holds. If I look at things that Ian is shaping for kilter or that Nick is shaping for kumiki, it's very much function. They put a lot of thought into how are you going to grab this hold? How does it feel? What does it make you do? But they're also beautiful. They're great to look at. And so, it's fun to see it all coming together. And I think that your perspective on it is really important in being able to draw the lines connecting those things inside the gym, within the setting, and just within the community that uses the space.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, so I appreciate you taking time out of your day. I know it's been a busy week, and sitting down with me here and for bringing me here. I thought, this was a great idea, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Ayo. I really love talking to setters who put this much thought into their work, and I couldn't ignore that Ayo also puts that same level of care into his art, his conversation, everything. And listening back to this really helped me realize that while having these conversations over 170 hour-long face-to-face conversations in the past 3 years has become an addiction for sure, I'm often missing some of the reflection that could come from them. And I'm going to work on that this year. I've put links in the show notes right there in your pocket supercomputer to photos of Ayo's art. Look closely at it. Zoom in. Take some time to realize the level of care that's involved. And if you get the chance, climb a circuit at the Minneapolis Bouldering Project, where Ayo is head setter, and realize the same level of care there. You'll also find a link in your show notes to follow Ayo on Instagram, and I suggest that you do that. And you already know where to find us as you close out 2018, powercompanyclimbing.com. You can support the podcast on Patreon. There's a link to that. And follow us on the social medias at Power Company Climbing on the Facebooks, the Instagrams, the Pinterest. And you could try to follow us on Twitter. It's not going to happen because we don't tweet. We scream like eagles.
This time, this time, this time, this time, this time for business, 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 this time